So, good morning. My name is Eija. I am Academy Research Fellow and Senior Lecturer of Global Development Studies at the University of Helsinki. I have the great honor to moderate the keynote speech, which will take the form of a conversation. After our initial conversation, we will first invite our esteemed Emeritus Professor Juhani Koponen, Professor of Development Studies, to give first commentary, and then we will open the floor for your questions and thoughts. I now have the great pleasure to introduce you, Dr. Robtel Neajai Pailey, our second keynote speaker. Dr. Pailey is Assistant Professor in International Social and Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science, a Liberian scholar activist working at the intersection of critical development studies, critical African studies, and critical race studies. She centers her research on how structural transformation is conceived and contested by local, national, and transnational actors from crisis-affected regions of the Global South. Dr. Pailey is author of the monograph Development, Dual Citizenship and Its Discontents in Africa, The Political Economy of Belonging to Liberia, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, which won the 2022 African Politics Conference Group Best Book Award and the 2023 African Studies Association of Africa Pius Adesanmi Memorial Award for Excellency in African Writing. This award-winning book also contributed to the passage of Liberia's dual citizenship law, earning Dr. Pailey the LSE's inaugural Rising Star Impact Prize in 2025. Previously a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Oxford and an Ibrahim Leadership Fellow at the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Pailey completed her doctorate in development studies at SOAS, University of London in 2014. In July 2024, she served as Liberia's 177th Independence Day National Orator and was inducted into the Order of the Star of Africa, one of the country's highest civilian honors for her distinguished service. We are so happy and honored to have you here at our FSDR 40th anniversary conference and at the University of Helsinki. Warm welcome.
Thank you very much for the very warm and generous introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. I think I would like to start by asking you something about your scholarly path. Looking at going through your really exciting CV, your career has taken many paths and really you are working at very interesting junctures. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that? And did academy choose you, or how did it go?
Sure. So I often start the story about my circuitous route to academia by sharing an anecdote from my father. So my father thinks of my career trajectory as incredibly unstable. So typical millennial, can't find a path and stick with it. So he often says to me, why can't you find one career, one city, one country, one continent, and just remain there? And my response is always that I can't find one city, one career, one continent, and just remain there because there's so many options to choose from. And so, yes, indeed, I took a very circuitous route to academia. I would dip my toes in and then dip my toes out. I in many respects, I say that I ran from academia as much as it chose me. And the reason I say that is quite often when I think about academia, or when I did think about academics in the past, I often thought that academics were in the business of pontification and no action. And I didn't want to be pontificating for the rest of my life. I wanted to be on the forefront of action and actually making a change in the lives of people who were near and dear to me, specifically in the continent of Africa and more specifically in my country, Liberia. So I've worked as a journalist. I've worked as a policymaker for the government of Liberia. I worked with the first elected woman head of state in my country, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, for 4 years. She was also the first African woman elected head of state. I also worked in development financing, as you mentioned, with the African Development Bank, and consulted for agencies as varied as the UN Economic Commission for Africa. I've consulted with international organizations as well as local organizations. But what I realized from all of these varied experiences is that these experiences informed my policy relevant scholarship. It informed my policy relevant sort of interest in action-oriented research, right? And so I completed a PhD at SOAS University of London in development studies, where I was trained as a critical development studies scholar. And when I think about critical development studies, this is where I feel like I found my home. Because in many respects, critical development studies really seeks to explain why, but also how alternatives can be found to some of the most wicked problems, such as poverty and inequality. I think critical development studies also rejects the sort of emancipatory claims of mainstream development. I think critical development studies exposes, most importantly, the contradictions of capitalism, and it identifies resistance to that capitalism in the development process. And so in many respects, now I can say to my father that critical development studies is my home, it's my city, is my continent, is my career, is my country. But it was a very long process of getting there.
Excellent. Now that you defined yourself as a critical development scholar, and I think that is how we define in Finland development studies quite frequently. So, but then let's go to the question that we are, as development scholars, we are most asked. How do you conceptualize development as a critical scholar?
Sure. So I often, when my students ask me this question, I love to start with the story of post-independence leaders, primarily in the continent of Africa, but I would even argue that post-independence leaders across the so-called global South, so in Latin America, in Asia, and in the continent of Africa, framed or understood or conceptualized development as self-determination, right? That development for them was not some sort of colonial external imposition. It was really about how do we provide the best level of care, self-worth, self-determination to our people. That's what they were preoccupied with. And so for me, that's what I think about when I think about development. So I often kind of conjure up the notion of Kwame Nkrumah, the first post-independence head of state in Ghana. And when he was fighting for self-determination, when he was fighting against British colonialism, he often talked about the fact that we need to seek ye first the political kingdom. And it's a big phrase that he was sort of alluding to. And so when Ghana finally actually got self-determination, when Ghana was actually able to wrest its control from the British colonial forces, he realized, wait a second, political sovereignty means nothing without economic independence, without economic sovereignty. And so he changed that phrase, seek ye first the political kingdom, to start preaching the gospel of seek ye first the economic kingdom. So that's what I think about when I think about development. So in terms of its kind of contemporary manifestation, for me, development is not the sort of single-minded pursuit of economic growth. It's not the single-minded pursuit of sort of participation in free market capitalism, right? Because often what happens is countries in the so-called global South in the sort of straitjacket of global capitalism, and they are to the vagaries of global capitalism. Most importantly, because I am a scholar of race, development is not the sort of privileging of Western whiteness and modernity, right? And the sort of foundations of that are Enlightenment thinking. And Enlightenment thinking fundamentally stated that Black and brown people were not capable of logic, right? Black and brown people, therefore, were not deserving of any sort of basic rights. That's not what I think about when I think about development. When I think about development, and I define this in my book, Development, Dual Citizenship, and its Discontents in Africa, as how people's experiences of poverty, power, privilege, and progress are constantly mediated to affect some type of change, right? How people's, and I'm also a literary scholar, so I think about alliteration, how people's experiences of poverty, power, privilege, and progress are constantly mediated to affect change. And for me, this definition is not just about the province of the so-called global South. I think development is happening everywhere. Right? So that's how I define development.
You already mentioned the concept of race. I think we could go back a few years back. I think it was, I don't remember how many years ago, but it was at the Development Studies Association's annual conference in the UK, where you challenged scholars, policymakers, and practitioners to decenter the wide gaze of development. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What is it that you mean by decentering the wide gaze of development? And maybe what is your view on whether that clarion call has it been answered?
Sure. So I don't know if people in the room are familiar with the, I would say, literary giants in the United States. Toni Morrison, who would have celebrated her 95th birthday this month. She was born on February 18th. So Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, another African-American literary giant, came up with a term called the white gaze. And they were speaking specifically about the literary canon and the American literary canon as suffering from a white gaze. What they meant by that is that in this white literary canon, Black people specifically were framed as deficient against a standard of whiteness. And so I was very, very taken by this phrase, the white gaze. And so I expanded it to argue that, as I mentioned earlier, mainstream development is really underpinned by racist logics. And these racist logics come from Enlightenment thinking that Black and brown people are deficient, that they're incapable of logic, and then therefore undeserving of basic rights. So in this speech that happened in 2019, that eventually became an article in Development and Change in 2020, I argue that there's also a white gaze of development. Right? And this white gaze of development then frames Black and brown people, particularly in the so-called global South, as deficient, as wanting, as regressive. And they're deficient, they're wanting, they're regressive against a standard of Northern, Western whiteness and modernity, right? And so what I did was I called for not only scholars of development, but also practitioners of development and policymakers of development to dismantle this white gaze of development, right? By viewing development, again, as not just the province of the so-called global South, that development is happening everywhere in different guises. I also said that it was important for us to center race as a sort of elephant in the room, right? We often talk about processes of socioeconomic transformation without thinking about race, right? So my clarion call was, we need to center race in our analysis of development in the same way that we center class and that we center gender. Because if we think about race as a system of ordering, right? It's a hierarchical system of ordering that effectively reproduces structural inequality based on place and race, and also reproduces systems of underdevelopment, right? So if you think about the process of capitalism, in many respects, there's a Caribbean author by the name of Cedric Robinson, who came up with the term racial capitalism. And he said, with capitalism also came systems of racism that were structured in dominance, systems of dominance, where you have whites at the top and Black and brown people at the very bottom, right? So my clarion call was, when we're talking about processes of socioeconomic transformation, structural inequality, we need to think about how race as a system of ordering has a fundamental place in that particular analysis. Now, you've asked me whether or not this clarion call has been answered in terms of decentering the white gaze of development. I think in some respects it has been. So after the article was published, it sort of coincided with the murder of George Floyd, the very brutal murder of George Floyd in the United States. And so a lot of development scholars started talking about race. They started writing about race. Development practitioners started talking about how it was important to think about race. And then people started jumping on the bandwagon of race and development in a very superficial manner, which I found to be incredibly troubling, because they weren't doing this as a sort of political project of rupture. They were really doing it as a form of whitewashing, pun intended. They were doing it as tokenistic posturing, right? So we know race, we're talking about race because it's important in terms of centering it. And then it's troubling, people wanted to talk about race and it sort of, analyze race because it was a form of careerist kind of advancement, right? You're ticking all the right boxes because race is trendy, it's sexy. And I found that particularly troubling because the real scholars of race and development were often sidelined, they were silenced, and their critical scholarship became a thing of the past. And I found that to be the sort of mainstreaming of race and development discourses became quite superficial, lost its luster. And so there's a sort of double-edged sword when you make that sort of challenge to people in the development space to decenter the white gaze of development. I find that I'm a little bit disillusioned by that process of decentering the white gaze of development.
Well, I think we all want to thank you for for your marvelous article and for really pushing this issue forward. It's so important. We may come back to this a bit later if we have time in our debate, but this discussion. But let's go then to the core of the topic of today's discussion, which is alternative development in a post-aid world. What are the different perspectives on aid, and which one do you find most compelling and why?
Okay, so there is a brilliant article written by a scholar by the name of Juhani. It was published probably, I think, in 2018, 2019, or thereabouts. And Juhani talks about this idea of the great aid debate. And she kind of conceptualizes it in three different perspectives. So she says that there are a group of people who consider themselves to be aid radicals. And within this particular aid radical perspective, she considers this to be the first wave. And this is underpinned by overwhelming pessimism around aid. But within the aid radicals, there are two different types of aid radicals. The first aid radicals are the sort of neo-Marxist leftists who argue that aid should be abolished because it is a tool of neo-colonial control and is a form of underdevelopment to keep countries in the so-called global south dependent on global capitalism, dependent on institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF that are the handmaidens of Euro-America, right? That's the aid radicals on the left. She says what's interesting is that the aid radicals on the left are in some respects with the aid radicals on the right. However, the aid radicals on the right believe that aid should be abolished for different reasons altogether. The aid radicals on the right are neoliberals. And we all know that neoliberals and neo-Marxists do not see eye to eye. So these neoliberals effectively believe that aid is inefficient. And what should drive socioeconomic transformation in the so-called global south is the market, the private sector, right? So that's the first wave, overwhelming pessimism. The second wave is what Juhani argues are the aid reformists. And these aid reformists believe fundamentally that aid should remain because it does produce socioeconomic transformation. What needs to happen with aid is that it has to be reformed through a sort of managerial way, right? So you want to make aid effective. And that underpins the whole aid effectiveness agenda that's come out of Paris and followed that, I think, the Accra Agenda for Action in 2008, which I attended in Accra in 2008, and then the Busan Aid Effectiveness Agenda. So that's the second wave. Optimism. Then she says that those two kind of polar opposites, the aid radicals, whether they be on the left or the right, or the aid reformists, are not the only two poles. There's also a happy medium of sorts called the aid realists. And the aid realists recognize that aid has utility, right? However, the problem with aid is that it does not fundamentally address the structural inequalities of global capitalism. It does not fundamentally address the structural inequalities of underdevelopment. And so if you can take the utility of aid and make it effective, yes, manage it well, but simultaneously address the root causes of underdevelopment, that's where you see structural social transformation taking place. And so you've asked me, where do I fit in this particular spectrum? And I'm curious to know where you all sit in this particular spectrum. But where I sit, you probably may have guessed, I'm an aid radical on the left, 100%. I believe that aid should fundamentally be abolished because it is a tool of neo-colonial control. And so what I love to do is, when I talk to my students about these different perspectives, is I kind of conjure up the kind of revolutionary socialists whose ideas about socio transformation I'm most aligned with. So let me ask, in terms of who's in the room, how many people are familiar with Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso? Okay, a few of you. Okay, this is fantastic. Usually when I say this man's name in certain places and spaces, clearly who Thomas Sankara is. Okay, so Thomas Sankara, I'm glad that I'm amongst friends. So Thomas Sankara, for those of you who are not familiar with him, he was a revolutionary leader in Burkina Faso. When he came to power in 1983, he changed the name of Burkina Faso from Volta, which was a colonial name, to Burkina Faso. And Burkina Faso is a Bosti language, people. And for me, that's such a great way of conceptualizing a nation born of self-determination, because what he's effectively stating is we have to be self-reliant. We have to stand on our own 2 feet, and we cannot do that with aid. It's not a viable strategy, or reliance on aid. It's not a viable strategy for development, this idea of self-determination as development. And so what he argued, he's famous for saying, he who feeds you controls you. And the reason he said that was because one of the, channels through which Sankara was attempting to achieve this notion of self-determination as development is to achieve food security. And he argued that Burkina Faso could not rely on exports or imports from outside, that it had to be food secure in order for it to develop. So he had this massive kind of food security plan in which, after about 2 or 3 years, Burkina Faso was able to achieve food security. Thomas Sankara was also feminist to the core, right? So he populated his administration with more than 2/3 women in his cabinet. There were other things that he did, so I don't want to dwell on all the different reforms that he instituted, but for me, those 2 were the most important. Thomas Sankara was a big radical on the left, right? He fundamentally believed aid was a tool of colonial control. And he argued, sort of on the international platform, that what the continent needed was complete abolishment of US debts, not any sort of reliance on aid, right? The other person that I often like to talk about is a scholar by the name of Ilhan Kapoor. And Ilhan Kapoor calls aid fraudulent kindliness. And I really love that idea of aid as fraudulent kindliness, because when you think about it, that's precisely what it is, right? When the USAID was dismantled by the first felon in chief, i.e. Trump, one of the first things that I started doing was digging up the facts and figures on USAID. And I realized at the end of the day, in terms of funding streams for USAID, 46% of USAID funding goes to or went to contractors. 46%, that's about 50% of USAID funding, right? So all this admin overhead cost from American contractors. The next level of beneficiaries of USAID funding, international implementing partners such as the United Nations, right? About 20-30%. And then a very small fraction of that aid gets channeled through national budgets of aid recipient countries, a very, very small fraction. So when you think about this notion of fraudulent kindliness, it's this idea that foreign financiers, because I don't call them donors, I don't think they're donating anything, because they fundamentally get more out of this particular arrangement than the so-called recipient. So foreign financiers, at the end of the day, are feeding off their aid budgets before it even trickles down to so-called ordinary people. It is fraudulent kindliness. And so I'll stop there to say that I'm an aid radical to the left through and through, and I probably will never change that position, especially now.
Thanks, Robtel. Yeah, I think we are living in a world where we are seeing a future with no aid, and I think in a quite different way to what left aid radicals were imagining currently. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, like how do you see that, in what ways has the retrenchment of aid forced us to look for viable alternatives? And what alternatives actually currently exist? And do they have the capacity to challenge the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about the retrenchment is many countries in the so-called global South were already weaning themselves off of aid. And I think this is what the aid realist perspective also says, is that the idea is not to abolish aid, but it's essentially for countries in the so-called global South to wean themselves off of aid gradually, so much so that it becomes obsolete, right? So that was already happening. This was a process that was already happening. I think there's a stat that I saw that about 30 countries in the so-called global South will move into middle income status by 2030 and therefore are going to be ineligible for ODA, right? More and more countries are entering middle income status and becoming foreign financiers themselves. We've talked about this in terms of the middle powers, right? In the so-called global South. So China, India, South Africa, so forth and so on. So I think this retrenchment has presented a really visceral opportunity for reconfiguring not only how development is conceptualized, but also how development is practiced, right? I mentioned this idea of countries weaning themselves off of aid. So there's been talk about domestic kind of resource mobilization, and what does diversifying domestic resource mobilization look like? So countries have said, how do we expand our tax base? How do we increase taxes, whether it be income taxes or taxing foreign multinationals coming in? How do we ensure that perhaps we're getting remittances income that is not just being channeled to households, but also be channeled for national broad-based development? How do we increase foreign direct investment, but not just extracting and exporting, that we're actually building a manufacturing base and industrializing in such a way that critical minerals are produced in spaces and places where they're being extracted from? I think one of the things that's been very heartening for me as a scholar of the continent of Africa, but also as somebody who loves my continent dearly, is conversations are being held in the African Union at the moment about Africa establishing its own credit rating agency. And the reason that conversation is sort of cropping up post-retrenchment in the sort of 21st century manifestation is we realize that the three credit rating agencies, so Fitch, S&P, and Moody's, are inherently biased against Africa, right? They frame Africa as a place of risk, right? And as a result, in terms of the credit worthiness of the continent is actually quite low. So the African Union, heads of state in the African Union are saying, well, why don't we come up with our own credit rating agency that in some respects challenges these three big credit rating agencies, but also complements them, right? So what's happening in terms of the discourse is recognizing that it's not that Africa borrows exponentially more than other regions of the world. That's the myth. That's the myth in the sort of public discourse. It's that the interest rates that countries in the continent of Africa pay are significantly higher than the interest rates that are paid by other regions of the world. And that is fundamentally unequal, right? So if Africa is able to establish its own credit rating agency, it will negotiate as a continent on more equal footing with bilateral partners, with multilateral partners, in stating that interest rates shouldn't be astronomically high for a continent that's already saddled with debt. So I think those are some of the examples that I see of alternatives to aid, and in this particular moment where the retrenchment of aid becomes an opportunity to think creatively, to think outside of the box, to think of some other viable alternatives that can replace systems of aid retrenchment.
Something that I've been thinking quite a lot lately is also whether there's any potential dangers in the withering away of aid. What kind of challenges or potential dangers would you see? Or do you see any dangers in the withering away of aid if you want to abolish the aid? But maybe like if we think, for example, about old dependencies, but is there a possibility that they are actually replaced by new kinds of dependencies? And I'm thinking on these lines.
Sure. So yes, as an aid radical on the left, I don't see any danger or, there are challenges obviously, but in terms of dangers of withering away aid, from a more kind of ideological perspective, some people might say it's impractical, but from an ideological perspective, I fundamentally believe that aid maintains the status quo of underdevelopment, right? That the high interest loans that come out of capital intensive infrastructure projects, for instance, that are financed by the World Bank and the IMF, create a vicious circle of debt distress for a lot of countries. And you see a lot of countries paying sometimes 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% of their GDP going to debt servicing, which is an abomination as far as I'm concerned, right? We also see that aid has high admin costs, overhead costs, as I've mentioned already. I've talked about the channels through which it goes through implementing partners, not through national budgets or even local organizations. So a lot of people are saying, well, what about localization? What about localization? We've seen that in many respects, aid also reproduces power asymmetries between aid recipients and foreign financiers. It also depoliticizes development, and it's shown development to be this sort of technical exercise of box ticking while concealing in many respects the structural capitalist sources of underdevelopment. And I think in many respects, aid is also biased in favor of countries that adopt market-friendly conditions or economic policies. So assistance is tied to economic conditionality, such as cuts in social spending, and we know what that does to education and health, for instance, liberalizing trade, and we know what that does in terms of imports and exports for a lot of the countries, devaluing currencies. And fundamentally, I don't think aid is altruistic. It's not humanitarian. It's not meant to be altruistic. It's not meant to be humanitarian. It's fundamentally strategic, and it's strategic for the foreign financiers. So because it's a tool for advancing the interests of foreign financiers, whether they happen to be in the North or the South, because we can talk about South-South cooperation as reproducing these aid dependencies. So what's happening right now is Western political economic conditionalities come in other guises in the so-called global South. Right. So an example that I often give to my students to make it a bit more concrete is when I worked for the government of Liberia, I was sent on a study tour to Sierra Leone because Sierra Leone had instituted dual citizenship, and we wanted to learn from their example. So I spent about a week in Freetown, which is the capital of Sierra Leone in West Africa. And in my conversations with colleagues in the State House, which is the presidency, the equivalent of our presidency, many of them were talking about the fact that how many people have been to Sierra Leone? Maybe from a show of hands. Okay, a few people. Okay, so in Sierra Leone, for those of you who've been, and those of you who don't know, Sierra Leone's international airport is on a small island called Lungi. And if you want to leave from the international airport to get to the mainland, there are a number of different options in terms of transport. You can take a ferry, which is abominably long. You can take a helicopter, which is faster but quite expensive. And the vast majority of Sierra Leoneans can't afford the helicopter. Or you can take a speedboat, which is slightly less expensive than the helicopter, but still cost prohibitive for the vast majority of Sierra Leoneans. Now, my colleagues informed me that a number of years ago, the Chinese government was in conversation with the Sierra Leonean government, and the Chinese government said, we will build you a bridge from Lungi, the international airport is, to the mainland, provided that anything under that bridge we own. Yeah, you laugh. I laughed as well. And I'm thinking, the blue economy, fisheries, so much that could be under that bridge. Luckily, the Sierra Leonean government was wise enough to say no. But I told my colleagues, I'm really happy they didn't come to my country, because we would have been like, come, bring the bridge. You can have anything under the bridge, right? And so what I tell my students is, quite often when we think about conditionalities as sort of Euro-American political economic conditionalities, but in South-South cooperation, conditionalities exist. They just come in different guises, right? So that's a sort of pessimistic way of looking at South-South cooperation as reproducing new aid dependencies or reproducing power asymmetries between foreign financiers in the so-called global South and aid recipients in the so-called global North. But there's another perspective. And when I think about South-South cooperation, there are two different ideas, right? You can think about South-South cooperation as third world solidarity, fist in the air, third world solidarity. Or you can think about South-South cooperation as a form of neo-colonialism, right? A reproduction of neo-colonialism. I think of South-South cooperation as something called forum shopping, and it's a term that I'm developing right now for an article that I'm trying to get published. And what I mean by this is, maybe the legal scholars in the room will be familiar with a term called forum shopping. So essentially, legal scholars argue that forum shopping is when people who are seeking justice in different countries will seek the legal jurisdiction, whether it's statutory law or customary law, where they believe they will have the most favorable outcomes, right? If you think about South-South cooperation as a form of forum shopping, you can say fundamentally that what South-South cooperation does, it enables countries in the so-called global South to seek the economic jurisdiction, i.e. development cooperation, that has the most favorable outcome. So it effectively just expands the choices that countries in the so-called global South have, right? So if you want to trade with China, you want to abide by the dictates of the World Bank and the IMF, you want to go to the new development bank that's established by the BRICS. The fact of the matter is you have choices. Before South-South cooperation became a thing, those choices were limited for countries in the so-called global South. So South-South cooperation is third world solidarity. South-South cooperation as neo-colonialism, I'm not 100% convinced by that. But South-South cooperation as forum shopping, as expanded choice, fundamentally, I think that's what's happening in the 21st century manifestation.
I'm looking at time. I would still have three questions that I would really like to pose you. But I think we can try to
Sure.
we can try them all still and have time for Juhani's
Sure, I'll keep my responses
comments.
brief.
This kind of neoliberal and colonialist forms of development aid, they have been really widely criticized already. However, lately I've been thinking a lot about these ideals of international solidarity. If we think of Nordic aid, it was also in certain decades quite strongly based on this kind of left-wing ideals of international solidarity and left-wing internationalism. I think what I'm somehow I want to ask you, like, are those just historical relics from the past, or could these kind of ideals of international solidarity, what is their role in today's world actually, and what forms should international collaboration take?
Sure. I mean, it's a really, really good question. I'm not 100% familiar with the Nordics in terms of how they frame aid as a form of kind of solidarity or international world making. So I can't really comment on whether or not it's more egalitarian than other forms of solidarity or international world making. But I mean, I wanted to talk about this during the forum yesterday, but there wasn't enough time. But one example that I've seen, and it's not necessarily through the mechanism of aid, but this idea of resistance and solidarity, was when South Africa brought its case forward to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, against the Israeli regime for effectively instituting genocide in Palestine. And for me, South Africa was a likely in this particular space, but unlikely in the sense that I expected other countries in the Middle East to be much more forceful in terms of having a pro-Palestinian stance, given the kinds of atrocities that we've seen in Gaza. And so for me, to see South Africa take this particular position and being ostracized by Euro-America as a result. So we think about the fact that now South Africa is labeled a place where a white genocide is taking place, which for me is the most ridiculous thing anybody could utter the history of the country and what's actually happening in the country right now in terms of economic inequality amongst Black and brown people in South Africa, and the vast majority of people who own the wealth are white South Africans. But the sort of aggression against South Africa for speaking truth to power and using the legal mechanism for bringing a case before the ICJ against the Israeli regime. South Africa has also taken a very strong stance in terms of hosting the G20 in 2025 and really having a very pro-Pan-African kind of position. Like, these are the aspirations of the continent of Africa. These are the challenges of the continent of Africa. These are the experiences that we've had as a result of the colonial encounter. And then bringing the case forward for the global South, right? No other G20 has ever been held on African soil. No other G20 has had these kinds of permutations that I've seen since 2025. So I think in terms of like a concrete, clear example of solidarities, I would say that South Africa is playing that role. It's really taking its place amongst the BRICS, amongst the regional hegemons in the continent of Africa, and saying, because we have a slightly bigger voice, we're going to use that voice to speak truth to power. We're going to use that voice to ensure that the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard, in the words of Arundhati Roy, the Indian scholar author, are heard, are amplified, right? I think the other thing for me in terms of reforming not only discourses and policies and scholarship is to really talk about the existence of not only self-reliance, so recognizing that it's important to be able to, again, the land of upright people, this idea of standing on our own 2 feet as nations, as individuals, but also the importance of global interdependence, that we all rely on each other for something, right? We rely on each other for resources, we rely on each other for support, we rely on each other for legitimacy. And if we can think of self-reliance and global interdependence as basically 2 sides of the same coin, I think the discourses around socioeconomic transformation, the discourses around how do we move forward as a human race, thinking about planetary revolution, those discourses and those ideas and the practices that follow them will significantly change, right? So this is global interdependence, not between countries in the so-called global South, but also countries within the South as well as within the North. And then lastly, quite often when we think about examples sort of agenda setting, it's always policy transfer from the so-called North to the so-called global South. But I think there's so many different examples. I mean, I think it was David who talked about the Zapatistas in Chiapas, right? There's so many different examples of revolutionary, broad-based civil society movements that are taking place across the so-called global South that the North can learn from. And there's so many interesting, important policy decisions, path dependencies that are happening in the so-called global South that the North can also learn from. And I think that became made manifest during the COVID pandemic, where a lot of countries in the so-called global South that had experienced political rupture and, existential threats such as Ebola, for instance, in West Africa, had a lot of lessons to tell. Like they had a lot of examples to show of how do you respond to a health crisis of this magnitude without losing large populations of people, right? So again, this idea of policy transfer is not unidirectional. It can be multi-directional. And if we are humble enough to realize that we all have something to learn from each other, then I think this idea of global interdependence on the other side of self-reliance will become something that we hold in high regard.
And then I would really like to go back to the concept of alternative. Over the last few years, I have sometimes even become afraid of using that term. And that is exactly because, as Professor Eija was saying in his keynote speech, the far right has taken over the anti-globalization debate, but it has also taken over the debate on alternatives. Even Trump has used this term. So somehow in this world where the far right has taken over the debate about alternatives through very racist ideology, and they are talking about complete abolishment of all kinds of collaboration with peoples and nations in this global South. So as critical scholars of alternatives, what should we think? What should we do?
We as scholars, we're like the experts. We're like the experts on discourse. Like we really are. And that's what I said earlier when I said, when I was younger, I used to think, those academics, all they do is pontificate every day. They don't do anything except think. And so I think we can use that as a strength, right? In terms of creating new discourses, recreating, reconceptualizing, reconfiguring how things are, to think about how do you do things anew, right? So I think we can't allow the far right, whether they be, mainstream ideas about development or political far right kind of movements, to hijack processes of thinking about alternatives as actual alternatives, right? Because I think the far right is more mainstream than alternative. So we can't allow them to hijack the term alternative. So I think what we need to do is reclaim this idea of alternatives from the mainstream to think about alternatives as fundamentally about social justice, fundamentally about dignity, reclaiming dignity for the vast majority of people across the globe, right? So for me, that's the alternative, not the mainstream alternative. Whereas the mainstream alternative preaches a politics of hate and division and indignity, what we need to do is to create an alternative that preaches and exemplifies a politics of equity and justice. And so that's what I would say is if they're preaching the gospel of extreme alternative, we need to be preaching a gospel of alternative. So that's how, let's play around with the language. That's what we do as scholars, right?
Yeah, that's true. And my last question would be, what would a post-aid world look like, and how do we get there?
Yeah, so I've kind of talked about this in passing, really, and it's, for me, the post-aid world is really creating systems of dignity. Systems of dignity for the so-called global South, but also systems of dignity for the so-called global North. Because, capitalism, neoliberal forces of kind of global capitalism are not just rearing the ugly head of the so-called global south. Patriarchy doesn't just harm women, it also harms men, right? Even if they don't want to admit it. At the end of the day, it is about reclaiming dignity for every single person, right? And then also thinking about how we environment, like planetary dignity as well. So there are a number of ways that we can do this, and I'll just go through some of the ways really quickly. So this idea of diversifying Southern income specifically through multiple financing mechanisms. So domestic resource mobilization, what does that look like? Manufacturing goods instead of extracting and exporting. South-South Development Corporation, which I mentioned earlier as forum shopping, as a form of forum shopping. So thinking about compacts with diasporas. I mentioned this earlier, I think yesterday during the forum, that if you look at the stats on remittances that are coming from migrant transfers, they actually supersede ODA. And they've superseded ODA for decades, right? So how do we ensure that those migrant transfers that are going to households are used for broad-based development, maybe through diaspora bonds, so forth and so on? Another thing that I think we can think about in terms of a post-aid world is, I often tell my students that I'm proponent of reparations than I am of aid. So there's a really brilliant scholar by the name of Deborah Thomas who's written a book on post-slavery Jamaica. And what she argues is we need to be thinking about a reparations framework for thinking. We're thinking about broad-based socioeconomic transformation. And she thinks about reparations in three frames. So she says reparations is about recognition, not only recognition of past harms, but how those past harms have contemporary manifestations in terms of socioeconomic inequality. So recognition is the first. The second is redistribution, right? Redistribution of material resources. Also redistribution of intangible resources. So restoring power and sovereignty to nations across the globe that have lost power and sovereignty, right? That's the second R in terms of the reparations framework for thinking. And then the third is reform. So what are the structures in place? What are the institutions in place that fundamentally create systems of dignity to completely different systems and create new systems through processes of reform? So reparations is something that I would talk about quite often. And then debt restructuring, which I've mentioned earlier. And then I think it was Lisa who talked a lot about corruption. So curbing corruption, especially when we're thinking about illicit financial flows leaving. She did talk about this $90 billion that leaves the continent of Africa on an annual basis through tax evasion. We need to figure out how to curb that. One thing that's come out of the tax justice network, which actually started in the continent of Africa and now has become a more global thing, is that they're moving slightly away from Transparency International's the perceptions of corruption index, because that's not necessarily empirical. It's more, the surveys that's used for the Transparency International survey is basically how people think that they experience corruption. Whereas the Tax Justice Network has come up with something called the Financial Secrecy Index. And I think that's a more concrete way of measuring corruption. It's how much illicit wealth leaves spaces and places in the so-called global south. I live in London, which is a tax haven of the world. But I think David Cameron a number of years ago hosted an anti-corruption conference in which he said to the Queen, and he didn't realize his mic was on, but he was introducing the Queen to Muhammadu Buhari from Nigeria. He said, I need to meet somebody from one of the most fantastically corrupt countries in the world. And you're sitting in London, which is a tax haven of the world. I mean, the irony of that for me was so visceral, right? So where are the tax havens? They're in the so-called North as much as they are in the so-called South, right? And then last but certainly not least, thinking about how do we reform international tax treaties such that countries are not paying exorbitant rates through interests that are fundamentally unequal. So for me, a post-aid world is really a world that produces dignity for everybody.
Thank you so much. I think actually we could give applause to Robtel at this moment. And then I would like to invite here for the commentary our Emeritus Professor of Development Studies, Juhani Koponen, please. And after Juhani's comments, I will open the floor for questions. So you can already start thinking what you would like to ask Robtel.
Well, I have now taken the pulpit, I'm afraid, or not because I think I'm above them, but because they didn't want me to sit there while they are conducting this discussion. I understand now why. This is quite a challenge, I must say. Are you now better? So, challenge. This kind of very, very wide-ranging, very engaging, inspiring talk, and after all, I cannot sort of take just a couple of things from here. I will be unable to give justice to your presentation. So just let me now make a couple of comments which I have had in my mind. One is about this racial question, white gaze. And another one is this alternative development post-aid world. And I think they are very much interrelated things. So I take them together, and then I comment. And I begin with this race thing because I think it is some sense it is foundational to our whole world order for the moment. And I very much agree with Robtel that race has been conspicuously absent in development discussion. It may now be given some, as you say, tokenist attention, but it has been the elephant in the room, which has not been there, which has not been seen there. And it needs urgent attention. And this might at first sound odd, because actually development was something that was meant to do away with racism. What was based on racism was colonialism, European colonialism in Africa and elsewhere. I mean, the colonialists, they legitimized their rule with the racist belief that these local people, they are unable to cope with the challenges of the emerging modern world. That's why they need the civilization development which the colonizers are bringing to them. But this was something that was supposed to be resolved with political independence. This kind of unequal relationship. When development came along, the development was presented as open to everybody, open to peoples of every color. It's based on what I call the ideology of developmentalism, which means its basic belief is that development is something which can be achieved through development interventions, which can be rationally planned, well-meaning interventions, in investments, projects, programs, so on and so forth. And this developmentalism has had it has been going through many phases. It has presented itself in many cases. It has changed much. The goals have shallowed from full-scale modernization down to alleviation of worst poverty, but at the same time, it has scattered to include all possible good things in the world, from human rights to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals with their 169 targets and 234 indications. Everything is there. What remains is the power, is the idea of the power of development intervention. But in fact, of course, we know development did not do away with racism. It just swept it under the carpet. It's there, it's somewhere there very much. And we all know that the racial hierarchies are still here, everywhere along us. In this country, with this government, we certainly know it. When we go to any development, what we call developing country, we see what kind of huge privileges that the white people still enjoy there. But if structural racism is there, why then the silence? And I think there are, of course, many reasons. But my argument would be that one of the main reasons might be, or is that development actually produces racism, not by design, by default, inadvertently, as an unintended consequence. Development, as we know, it's something that brings material wealth and power. I think it's not only enlightenment. It's also it brings material wealth and power. If the white people enjoy privileges in developing countries, it's because they have resources, they have money, which they can use. Not because they are regarded as superior people as such. And the money they have because they come from rich countries that consider themselves as developed and provide a model for development. And this then affects mental structures on both sides, which change only slowly. So this is something which raises many questions. What can we do with this? As researchers, we can, of course, choose topics which somehow tackle this. But I think this is ultimately a political question. We are now back here with Kuma political kingdom. We are back in the fact that the truth is not out there. It must be made. These are political issues which demand political resolution, and a political resolution demands political action and political struggle. And then I want to go to this other thing, alternative development post-aid world. I must say I don't believe we will have a post-aid world in a fairly foreseeable future. Of course, we have all this that we know what is happening, but anyway, I know the people will be aiding each other, of course, and there's no end of demand for humanitarian aid in offering. But what is now in danger being shut down is a very specific form of aid, development aid, ODA, which is part of this developmentalist ideology. But development ideology and aid, both they are meant to maintain, or at least were maintain, the post-Second World War liberal or social democratic order, Western order, is based on capitalist market economy. But other aid that will go on. It is more important as a tool in international affairs than it could be jettisoned. Just like that, we can see this even in the United States. I'm closing down U.S. aid, which actually followed quite developmentist lines. Does not mean the end of all U.S. aid. On the contrary, and U.S. aid was actually a small part of the much larger foreign aid program which the United States had and still has. Of course, they're giving massive amounts of military aid, mainly to Israel, but also the civilian aid is going to continue. There are new agencies old agencies for infrastructure and private investment, new agencies being established. Also bilateral aid will be continued with very carefully selected partners, but this will be more transactional, even more transactional than the old ODA, quite openly geared to serve US political and economic interest. I mean, promoting friendly leaders, getting access to minerals, so on and so forth. And other donors are going in the same direction. Smaller ones, as Finland, also following in their footsteps. Now, if this ODA, are you telling me to stop? Or?
Yes, I was inclined to do that, but please take your time.
Just give me a few minutes still. Well, if this ODI is going down the drain, so what are we going to make out of it? Are we going to sit down and wait the dignity business come up from there with its own logic? I don't know. I mean, critical development scholars, myself included, we have long complained about the mixed results, unknown and hidden impacts, donor-driven nature, and also the transactionality which is there, has been there, and cost efficiency of ODA. And it may be tempting to say a good riddance to it. And I must say I feel quite attracted to the position of left radicalism. But I come back to this. But there's a but. The many bats. So my part is the alternative. If it looks even less attractive, what is left to us then? And then there's a real possibility, of course, that the big southern countries, China, India, Brazil, they will take over the flag of developmentalism. They will carry it. Oh, I'm sorry if you are missing my what I'm trying to tell you. I think that it has actually already happened that people like China, India, Brazil have taken over developmentalism. They have been quite happy to reduce worst poverty in their countries with order, but as far as I can see, they are aiming at modernization, really. And they're ready to do it with their own resources and even put aid programs on their own, as we heard. But this again raises huge questions on issues like the ecological carrying capacity of our Earth, of which there's only one piece, and already under heavy pressure, and about the injustice of how global resources have so far been shared. So which finally brings us to these other alternatives that we were discussing. This question of self-determination, forming perhaps Pan-Africanist institutions, these kind of things. I don't know if we are here entering the realm of utopias, but as Eija has argued in her own work that although utopias may sometimes or often be unattainable, unimplementable, they are still useful. They may point the direction to where we would and could go. So I think all these things which you present, they are great. They're great ideas, and I think they must be attempted. They must be given space. Again, this is a political question. question very much. It depends on policies and politics, of course. But these are things that can be only be. This will be only sort of. They will be only implemented. They will be only realized in practice. And here comes my last but. So I said that I am very much impressed or sort of attracted to left-wing aid radicals, but I think it would also need certain amount of measure, certain measurement, the measure of aid or other realism. For instance, you were very enthusiastic about Sankara, and I understand it. I have also myself much admired what he was able to do. But as you know, if you look at Burkina Faso today, the reality is quite different there.
Thank you so much, Juhani, for your comments. Let's now take two questions. There is one starting there and another one here. Thank you. So if you can maybe approach.
Is it on now? Yeah. Thanks very much for your great talk. My name is Riina Bhatia, and I'm a doctoral researcher here at the University of Helsinki. And I have a question to you relating to the alternatives. And you also mentioned industrialization. So my question is, what would an alternative industrialization look like? And I base my question on a recent paper published by, or written by Max Ali, on the critique of post-development. And this was endorsed by Jason Hickel, who is a prominent scholar in degrowth, who is saying that sort of post-development lacks this theoretization of imperialism and theory of labor. And it's true that both literature sort of look for alternatives from the grassroots movements and from alternative epistemologies and different types of technologies that are really tied to low-scale appropriate technologies. So my question is that if we take the ecological critique, which I think is quite fair from degrowth and post-development, but we try to achieve sort of some type of industrialization in terms of gaining self-sovereignty and self-determination. So what, in your perspective, would such industrialization that takes into account different epistemologies and takes considerably seriousness with the ecological devastation that we've seen with industrialization, what would such industrialization look like? Thanks.
Thanks. And if the other one was on this side, and while you take the mic there, I will read one question from online, from Kyle Bailey. I have a question about what development policies left-wing parties in Europe and North America can propose as alternatives to aid dependency and neo-colonialism. For example, if we propose the formal nationalization of a large multinational company significantly involved in resource extraction on the African continent, what could we do substantively to substantively improve terms of trade and improve the standing of African workers within the cooperation structures? So this was the second question, and let's then go to the third one, please.
Hi, so my name is Felix. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Uvascula. I want to just look at the vehicle of this alternative development that you talk about. You talk about Sankara, about Nkrumah, and this happened in an era of, can I say, leftist ideology and all that. If you want to reimagine this sort of development, especially across West Africa, young people are interested in Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. They are interested in strong leaders. What kind of leadership, what kind of political system do you envisage to bring this about? I'm also talking about democracy on the backslide in West Africa, for example, but I'm not also interested in the Western kind of democracy. So what kind of democracy would you like to propose where this comes about? Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Oh my goodness, such tough questions. Really, really good questions, though. Maybe I'll start with your question. So I think you mentioned at the end that the sort of Sankara moment has passed, and Burkina Faso looks very different than it did in the 80s when Sankara was in office. And then I'm going to link into what you just asked. So people in the room may or may not be familiar with Ibrahim Traoré, who's sort of fashioning himself as Sankara incarnate, a 21st century manifestation of Sankara. I'm not 100% convinced yet. He's got to do a little bit more work to convince me that he is a Sankara incarnate. And the reason I say that is because in many respects, Sankara preached the gospel of self-reliance. He also preached the gospel of revolutionary socialism. He also preached the gospel of Pan-Africanism. And he believed fundamentally that before the continent of Africa looks outward, it must look inward. And so I'm a bit wary of Ibrahim Traoré's, although I think in terms of domestic sort of national policy making, in terms of nationalizing state-owned enterprises, making sure that somebody asked about industrialization, manufacturing, making sure that resources are not extracted from Burkina Faso, that are kind of produced and manufactured in the country, and then this idea of trading within the Sahel, right? But what troubles me about his kind of political stance is the sort of bromance with Putin. And although people argue, well, he's been kind of demonized by the West and he has no other choice but to formulate strategic partnerships outside of that particular configuration, the fact of the matter is Putin is waging a neo-imperial war in Ukraine. So the kind of ideological stance doesn't really make any sense to me. There's a contradiction in terms as far as I'm concerned, right? But in terms of broad-based national development, as it were, I think he's doing much better than a lot of countries in the Sahel, a lot of the countries that broke away during coups or revolutionary coups in the Sahel. What I will say in linking kind of his policies to some of the questions that have been asked before is that as far as I'm concerned, I don't think this idea of development and democracy as being mutually exclusive. And democracy, when I think about democracy, I'm thinking about kind of consensus building, broad-based expansion of choice, the idea that one person doesn't have a monopoly over power. That's what I think about when I think about democratizing or democratic consolidation or democracy. And I don't think those ideals are foreign to the continent of Africa. I mean, we had systems of political decision-making that were communal in their orientation, where one chief didn't make a decision for an entire village, that there was consensus building, there was deliberation, there was decision-making based on the whole, not an elite few, right? So there's systems of democracy that existed in parts of the so-called global South long before the colonial moment. And I would argue, there's a really good friend of mine she's based in the UAE now, but she was previously based at Wits University. And she talks about the Mosi in Burkina Faso as being one of the most democratically structured societies across the continent of Africa. The Mosi happen to be in Burkina Faso now. So I think if we return to, instead of throwing out so-called traditional or so-called systems of political decision-making that existed long before the colonial moment and realize, okay, what worked here, right? Going back to this notion of appreciative inquiry that basically says, even when systems are completely discombobulated, we have to look at what actually worked in particular systems, in particular structures, in particular societies. Can we return to those and reconfigure them for this particular present moment? And that's what I would like to see we as continental Africans doing. It's not saying, oh, democracy cannot coexist with development and we need strong leaders, we need authoritarian leaders in order to drive development. The fact of the matter is processes of development, processes of democratic consensus building can coexist, and they must coexist if we're going to create new worlds. We're going to create new systems of political consensus building. And I think that that's not just about the continent of Africa. I think this is the case across the globe, because I would argue that systems of democracy in the United States are severely eroding. And that is not a model that I want to follow. So I always kind of crack a joke and I say, if you look at, because I do a lot of work on democratic consolidation in Liberia, and I compare it to other parts of the West African subregion. If you look at Liberia as a sort of post-war country, Liberia is significantly more democratic than the United States. We have more independence in our legislature than you see independence in the United States. So there are examples on the continent of Africa that we can use in terms of how do you create broad-based consensus building? How do you create expanded choice so that people feel like they have multiple options available to them for political representation? So I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but I think I've answered your question and perhaps even responded to yours in terms of where's Burkina Faso as we see it today. In terms of the question around alternative industrialization, so I'm trying to, it's funny, I always tell my students, sometimes I have these senior moments where I forget bits and pieces of information that I've studied before. But in the Sahel, pre-colonial Sahel, there were systems of agricultural kind of productivity that existed before the colonial moment in which people in the Sahel created adaptability mechanisms to address rainfall while also building systems of agricultural productivity. As far as I'm concerned, that's a form of industrialization that existed long before the colonial moment that perhaps could be reproduced in the 21st century moment, whether it's in the Sahel or in other parts of the so-called global South, where you are working with nature and not against it, that you're building adaptation as you are producing food that you can actually eat, right? Growing your own food, being able to not only feed your people, but also export any sort of excesses outside of your country. And then doing that first within your region and not necessarily outside of a particular continent. So there are examples, and I mean, maybe it sounds incredibly idealistic, but there are examples of systems of traditional industrialization, systems of pre-colonial industrialization that existed that could perhaps be retrofitted for the 21st century moment so that we're not, again, working against nature, we're working with nature and creating systems of mitigation, creating systems of adaptation that work for the kind of crisis or climate crisis that we're encountering today at the national level, at the local level, at the grassroots level, but also at the continental and kind of global level as well. I forgot the question that was online. I can't remember what it was.
Yes, the computer has now disappeared, so, and the time is already up, so I think we can leave it like that. I think we have to, unfortunately, start to wrap up now. We really want to thank you so warmly, Robtel. This has been inspiring. We have learned so much from you. Thank you for these really, really important contributions.